And one of the things that Chris, everybody, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. One thing Chris mentioned is questions. Feel free to jam them in anytime. I would prefer this to be, either in person and have all of y'all in a room and let's have at it. So don't mind. I won't get distracted. So please do. So F710, jumping right in. I want to go, the history of F710 and ASTM overall. Well, back to this nameless face ASTM. One thing everybody on this call needs to understand is ASTM is an open membership. You can be a member. We meet twice a year, May and November, so you can be part of influencing these documents. It is a time commitment, obviously, in travel this year. Next month we're meeting in Denver. In November we met in Clearwater, so there's that travel. But you can join these and slowly start evolving these standards, which is what I did. I've been now involved for about a decade, and look, now I've actually authored 2 ASTMs or been the principal author. So now back to F710. This is probably the granddaddy ASTM for all of flooring. That's the standard right there. It says resilient flooring. Please don't let that title fool you. A lot of other products have adopted this or have evolved their own standards, their own publications from this document. But this is the real granddaddy. If you're an installer and you're going to have one ASTM, this is the one you really want to have. You can see it was first established in 1998, and these dates will become important as we go through. And since then, this is not a lie, it has become one of the most purchased ASTMs of all time, perhaps because it's actually been updated 10 times since then. Now, one of the important things about this document, we think about moisture, and I know there's the A11 committee from NFCA on moisture, and I'm glad to see that's happening. It was this document that set the requirement that all slabs be tested for concrete, and that started 25 years ago, and that's the exact paragraph. That has not changed. That's what established it. I throw in the calcium chloride test in there because coincidentally, that's the same year that calcium chloride became a standard. But before I go a bit further, I want to just give you a quick historical rundown of where moisture testing came from. Quick history, if you go back to the oil embargo of 1973, energy costs shot through the roof. Price of gas went from $0.25 to $1 in the US. Oh, we'd love to go back there right now, right? But it was a 4 times increase. Gas I saw today was $3.50 a gallon. I know it's a lot more expensive up in Canada, but it'd be like me going out tomorrow and seeing it being at $14 a gallon. Everybody's attention. Well, our society, our buildings are the biggest consumer of energy. So what occurred is that the energy bills for buildings went through the roof. So what you had is property managers, owners really tightening down, turning off the HVAC at nighttime, turning off on weekends, shutting down schools over the summertime. Think about little signs next to lights saying, if you leave, turn it off. All these things really altered the capacity fresh air exchange. They sealed up, caulked up everything. So now we had a sealed up tight building, weren't taken into account, was the building breathing, first planting condensation. And then we had mold growing in the wall cavities. We had mold growing behind impermeable drywall, below impermeable floor covering. And by 1984, sick building syndrome was recognized as a global issue. Probably what accelerated the situation was in 1987, one of our EPA headquarters buildings in Washington, D.C. changed out about 250,000 square feet of broadloom carpeting. Now, all this is written up in the Federal Register, completely open public resource. In that change, an adhesive was used with a compound that prior to this manifestation had never been identified. And what occurred is within a year of the flooring change, over 100 people were out sick. Migraine headaches, respiratory distress, a lot of different issues manifested. In the investigation, a pretty strong indication, a correlation was drawn to the flooring. That led to what was called the carpet talks. And don't let the carpet fool you, was really the entire flooring industry. As a result, 1992, the Carpet Indoor Air Quality publication came out, which coincidentally coincides with the Green Label program. And what I want to point to this date is that this is a very seminal date in the adhesive formulation. Prior to this, quote unquote, we had the good glues, we had the VOC laden adhesives. And then after this, we had very much more water-based adhesives. I'm not here to knock either glue. They both work if used correctly. But quite simply, a VOC-based adhesive chemically has what it needs to basically self-cure in almost any range that you would install of humidity and temperature. Whereas a water-based adhesive does not. It needs to give off excess moisture to the ambient humidity or ambient environment. So if it's too humid, it won't cure properly. If it's
Dean, with those same high VOC adhesives, like the cutback adhesive we all sort of know about, be affected by pH in the same way, or would they overcome that challenge as well?
Actually, pH testing wasn't required either. pH testing wasn't required until 1998 as a standard. So they would have different requirements. That's actually a good question. Remember, pH, what causes the breakdown of a water-based adhesive from a pH hydrolysis? The pH goes up and it starts chemically breaking down the water-based adhesive. So when you have a different chemical compound, you're not going to have possibly the same introduction of moisture. You're not going to have the same chemical reaction. They may not be affected by pH. They may be suppressing the moisture itself, not letting it, they may actually be pH. We have, basically pH proof adhesives now today, but they were much more pH resistant, and pH as a requirement was not even added until 1998 along with moisture. So excellent question. Both kind of go in tandem. Neither one was required. So remember, this is 1992. The requirement to moisture test didn't come about to 1998. So it was a 6-year gap.
And we had like 13 years of ongoing failures from the point of 92, once the big change from VOC and water-based kicked in.
Correct. And the only substantive change that really came out in 1998 was test the concrete for moisture. I haven't gotten into ambient conditions yet. I haven't gotten to dew point yet. I haven't gotten to substrate porosity. The substantive change after 6 years of failures will test the concrete. And that's with calcium chloride. And it wasn't until 2003 that the RH test got into F710. Now we're 11 years after the glues changed. And then it wasn't until almost a full 20 years that HVAC or any mention of requirement to control the ambient conditions. And I want to ask all your listeners out there, and you can see my face here, and I did this yesterday with Chris, has anybody ever done this with super glue? Regardless of where you are, you only have so much time. That is a VOC adhesive. Now, if you did the same thing with a water-based, a really heavy wet set adhesive, you got a lot of time. The super glue, the chemical reaction is not driven by ambient temp humidity. Yeah, if it was hotter, it'd probably kick off faster, but it's going to be much more resistant to ambient humidity. It's going to be able to fight through that. You're going to be able to install that at 90% RH, and it's still going to activate. You do that with a water-based adhesive, it's going to do nothing. It's going to sit there. And this is the exact language that was in 2011. And you can see it creates a box. It creates a box of temperature, on average 65 to 85, and it creates a box for ambient humidity, 35 to 55. I will tell you this as a caution. This is an average. You must check the product you're installing. A new glue, a good glue that just came out from a rubber manufacturer, their box is 65 to 73, which is the narrowest I've ever seen, but that's the manufacturer. We were talking yesterday and a big discussion point came up, and Chris asked, is it required for the HVAC? F710 is clear. It's not required to have the HVAC running. However, it is required that no matter what the contractor is doing to achieve these conditions, it must be maintained. So if it's heat, if it's dehumidifiers, how they do it is not the important. The requirement is that it maintains inside that box. The problem is if they are not tracking and it's drifting. Yes, sir. So data loggers, there's a lot of great technology out there. you can have it. It is not just, it's the whole space. Wherever the installer is working, that's what it is. And notice the middle bullet, 48 hours prior to beginning through the installation. And some of these flooring products, it's post-installation too, because their temperature range does not go up afterwards. Some resilient flooring adhesives, once installed, it's good up to 90, 95, 100 degrees, especially radiant heat or whatever. But before, during, and after, some is even greater, and that goes for moisture testing too. But notice, go ahead, Chris.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Say, we had a project in a very cold area of Canada where, you know, it's not unusual for the relative humidity to drop to like 10% and minus 30 and all that, and swings the other way as well. And we were the inspection service on the it's a commercial site, and we had a pre-installation site meeting and advised the general contractor of what they were going to have to provide, what that box was that you're talking about,
right,
between 35 and 55% RH, and a 20-degree swing in temperature starting at about 18 Celsius, which what is that, 65?
Yeah, it's right there. Yep, 18. Yep.
Anyway, he looked at us like we were crazy. You know where you are? He said, it's like the conditions are all over the map. And we said, yeah, we're going to help you with that. And we recommended data loggers. And he begrudgingly went and got them, but he did do that. And he set them up around this 100,000 square foot project. And I kid you not, after 6 months in, he phoned me unsolicited and said, basically, wow, I love this. I'm in control of my site. I now know when a delivery guy has come, left the door open and driven away, and we've got cold air blowing into the building.
Or a wet spot from dew, because the temperature that was warmer and this cool, moist air comes in, and immediately now I know why my floor is wet.
Yeah, he was excited to pick up he said, I do two things in the morning. I pick up my Tim Hortons coffee, and then I pick up my data logger.
Well, now with Bluetooth, I was just at an FCICA convention down in my Fort Lauderdale, Miami, a couple quarters ago, and with the Bluetooth technology, the app, they can look on their phone, they can look on their iPad.
Yeah.
While they're at Tim Hortons having their coffee, not even worried about it, they just log in and they can see the conditions and see if it's
3 o'clock in the morning.
Doesn't matter.
It drops off or it stays level. It's got to be.
Well, because actually, the system I saw, it will send an alert that you've drifted out of range. So to say they can't, so again, I'm going to move on from this slide, but I want to be clear that controlling via HVAC is not required. That's just the easiest way to track it. But we all know most likely that is absolutely not going to occur, because the owner doesn't want the HVAC running, sucking up construction debris. So most likely mechanicals are not going to be running, especially for new construction. It's not going to happen. However, the HVAC is not required. Tracking to be in that box, yes, sir, that's required. And I will offer for your installer members and the installer community out there on this call, this provides you a lot of protection, because quite frankly, if the project cannot show that these conditions have been maintained and sustained, this document right here, F710, is your easy out. Say, unless you're going to absolve me, I can't install. This is outside the conditions. So this is there for your protection as well as your knowledge, and there's absolute ways to do it. Before I move on, one last comment. We also talked about yesterday, propane heat. A lot of people say you can't do propane heat. That's not actually true. Propane heat is fine. It's the exhaust. The exhaust of propane heat is high in carbon dioxide. So let's go back to that 100,000 square foot job that Chris was talking about. If you use propane heat salamanders, you're supposed to have the big duct work and vent the exhaust gas outside. If you don't, over time, the propane exhaust will elevate the carbon dioxide level inside that project. Not enough to hurt us, not enough to make us lightheaded, not enough to affect us. We won't even notice it. But even a few percentage points higher of carbon dioxide will cause what's called excessive carbonation of the concrete surface, and it will manifest as a dusty surface. There's two main causes for a dusty surface: trout and bleed water, excessive carbonation. Where y'all are up in Canada, cold months, longer cold months, it is a greater possibility that could occur. So if you,
I did not know that. That's awesome. How many sites do you hear? I can't get rid of the dust. It keeps coming back. Maybe that's it.
if you ever go out, it'll be absolutely immediate. So envision this: you're out there, you're down on the ground. Let's say you're doing a bond test, you're prepping the site, you're cleaning. Even if you've got a wet rag, you're rubbing it, you're letting it dry, and you vacuum the heck out of it. Well, and then you rub your hand on it, and you still got dust on your fingers. That's a dusty slab, and it's not dust like on your bed or on your windowsill. It is the surface of the concrete. The structure is so weak, you wouldn't notice by footprint, and it's not going to let you sink into it because of the spread load. But it's soft enough sometimes that you can actually scratch it with your fingernail. That dusty layer either has to be completely ground away, or there are some materials you could spray on that helps cross-link and stabilize. So that's the two reasons. If you come across that, it's not because your prep is really bad. It's either try and bleed water or see how they're exhausting the salamanders. So there we go. Some recent changes.
Sorry, we have one question here.
Go ahead, please.
Jason, if you can.
Thanks. Yeah, Chris mentioned about the warehouse, and then Dean said, you know, the cold air, if you leave the garage, the door open, the cold air comes in and the warm surface creates a dew point. But isn't it the opposite? Isn't it the warm air to a cooler surface? Isn't that why we make sure our concrete substrate is 10 degrees above Fahrenheit, above dew point?
Well, yeah, there you go. Yeah, but it also, yeah, because cold air holds less moisture, so it'll be reversed. Correct.
Okay.
There you go.
All right, thanks.
Yep. It'd be correct. Yep. It's the warm, moist air under a cold surface. So there you go. And also, too, before I move on, as far as these temperatures go, it comes to play when I go into dew point. Going back to 2011, nothing on this table or this slide talks about the substrate surface temperature. And that was not added into F710 until 2022 when dew point evaluation. So let's think about, you're installing on the second floor, your space is acclimatized, but the first floor is still being used for storing equipment. And I've done a lot of projects where they install top down. So again, not quite your environment up in Canada, but I was involved with a project in actually North Carolina. And they were installing the second floor. They'd already done 90,000 square foot of rubber, no problem. 6 months later, they're doing the other half. And now the bond test was failing. And I'm like, same concrete, it's even 6 months older. Same flooring contractor, same adhesive, same everything. I'm like, 6 months later in time. And then I asked the contractor 2 questions. I asked him 3 questions. I go, is this bond test on slab on ground or elevated? I said the second deck. He goes, the slab on ground is open because we're storing equipment. That'll be the last floor we finish. I said, okay. Second question, what was the temperature of the concrete surface when they spread the glue? And he got quiet. He goes, well, we have the space controlled. I said, that's air. What's the temperature of the surface of the concrete? He's like, well, I don't know. I'll find out, but why? I said, because I just checked the weather in North Carolina. It's been 39 degrees for the past 3 weeks. If the bottom's open, that the bottom of that upper slab is open to the cold. My guess is your concrete's around 50 degrees. That glue has to be at 65 degrees. So basically, you take a water-based glue out of your bucket. You don't test the surface of the concrete. You put it on a cold surface. The layer of the glue touching the concrete substrate surface just went to sleep. The top part tacks off, no transfer. You put your bond test down, 3 days later, you pull it up and it's a big wet spot. He goes, that's exactly what happened. I go, your slab's too cold. So it was, remember, this is 2011. And it wasn't until 2022, the requirement to even evaluate the substrate surface temperature was added. And if you think about it, the substrate surface temperature is the really driving factor based on what the glue is going to be touching. So keep that in mind. So like I said, this is the most prominent document for installing flooring, resilient flooring on concrete. But again, it goes to any kind of flooring really, because it affects carpet as well. Some recent changes. Go ahead.
Confirmation of a question. Someone asked that propane burns or creates vapor, water vapor as an exhaust as well, which is also why you want to
Correct.
take
You
it-
want
get
to,
it
you want
outside the
to,
building.
right. That's correct. So not only is it the carbon dioxide, it will also elevate the humidity, um, which is, could be problematic depending on what your conditions are. So you want to vent everything outside. I just want to be clear to everybody that, a fuel burning heat source if you see it, it's not necessarily a cause for, the sky is falling. But what could be cause for very concern is if it's not vented and it's just venting, which is, by the way, is a common practice. You'll go on a big job site, and they'll have propane heat out there and it's not vented. Once that space gets enclosed, it could cause some serious problems later on when you go to install concrete or install flooring. So if you get to that point to where you're there and the concrete is dusty and you see that, that's a pretty clear indication that you're going to need a change order, or somebody's need that concrete surface, because you can't glue to it, because then you glue it and it'll just come right up because it's
A
dusty.
disaster for gypsum. We
Well,
got a
that's-
problem when you walk into a site and it's like it's feels like a sauna. It's warm in
Well,
there, and it's
yeah, I
wet.
got one of your pictures here later on. That's the flip thing for the sauna thing. But so again, I want to kind of the date, 1992, the glues changed. It wasn't until 2016 that a new ASTM 3191 to evaluate the substrate surface porosity. And thank you, Chris, for these pictures. And you can see the lower left. That's basically what it is. It's a dime-sized drop of water, and the standard says 60 seconds. But the standard also says check with the manufacturer. Check with the manufacturer. If the manufacturer says 2 minutes, then you wait 2 minutes. If the manufacturer says wait 5 minutes, then you wait 5 minutes. But then what the standard says is if the manufacturer does not define it, then do 3191. This is now a requirement for all resilient flooring installations. And I want to add a caveat. It's not just for the concrete, because remember, you can install resilient flooring on a well-bonded course of resilient flooring. You don't have to necessarily move it depending on what kind of flooring you're installing. So literally, no matter what your glue is going to touch, it needs to be tested. A lot of times people will, projects, big commercial installation houses, as a practice, they'll skim coat, feather finish, prep the entire surface of the concrete. Not a bad practice, but that's not what the glue is going to be touching. The glue is not touching the concrete anymore. Now you got to test the surface of that. This idea that, I skim the entire surface, it's going to be porous, or I put an underlayment down, it's going to be porous, is not actually true. It only takes 60 seconds to do this water drop. I can't stress enough the importance of this particular test. And, this is a great picture that Chris provided. So again, in 1992, the glues changed, a lot more water. Well, if you've got a non-porous substrate surface and you apply a water-based adhesive, let's pick on glass or steel, where's that excess water going to go? So if you don't apply the right open time to allow the ambient conditions to evaporate that excess moisture to it, like a lot of times snow transfer or just, slight transfer, and you lay in your drop too soon, yeah, you could have a moisture-related flooring failure, and the moisture actually came from the adhesive being trapped, the excess moisture in the adhesive being trapped. Compounding this is a lot of adhesives, and there's no issue with this, are good for porous or non-porous. But you have to look at the instructions. If it's a pressure sensitive, a lot of times the instructions don't change. It's the same installation instructions. But for resilient adhesive, it may say for porous, use a 16 by 16 by 16 square. But for non-porous, the same exact glue may say use a 16 by 32nd by 32nd U. And if you look at the volume, the non-porous takes about half as much glue. So the same thing, if you've got a non-porous substrate, even though the glue says it's good for non-porous and you use the wrong trowel, you've double applied the amount of glue. It's going to tack off the surface. It's still going to have too much glue, too much water. you lay it in, it could be oozing up through, if you're doing VCT or plank, it could be oozing up through the cracks or inducing a failure going forward. So I can't stress enough, going back to 1992, the importance of the porosity test. And like I said, in 2021, even though the test standard got approved in 1990 or 2016, it took 5 more years to become a requirement in 2021, almost 30 years after the glues changed. The glues changed in 1992. It became a requirement test for absorption in 2021.
Dean got a great question here from Clayton Schull.
Hey, Clayton.
Does 60 seconds mean when the water starts to absorb or is fully absorbed?
No, it's once you've put the drop of water, once that drop of water forms, the clock starts.
So when it's completely absorbed or when it's...
Oh, no, it's 60 seconds later, it's gonna still be sitting like that. It won't absorb. I've seen it sit there for 11 minutes. They just finally got tired and just wiped it away.
Yeah.
Fully absorbed is, and this is a terrible example. Think of a CMU cinder block, you put it on there and it goes in and it's going to spread out and pull out. And you can see that profile of that slab that Chris sent. It's even got, it looks like it's been sanded or something. So it's got some good prep there. And that water drop is still sitting there. So the whole porosity and non-porosity thing is, we were making a change because people were like dropping it from 6 inches high and it was splattering. It says a drop of water placed no higher than a half inch because we don't want it to splatter. But so Clayton, literally, once you've done the dropper, the clock starts immediately, and 60 seconds later, if it's sitting so like that, that's non-porous. Or some adhesives may say 2 or 5 minutes, but it's not from the time it absorbs. It's the time from when you place the drop.
Yeah.
So let's take this next step further. A lot of people assume, for whatever reason, that the substrate is going to, and this is, look how big this issue is. A lot of people have assumed that the substrate is porous and they've proceeded along with adhesive application. ACI, American Concrete Institute, is very clear. All concrete, especially commercial concrete, is going to be troweled, and it's most likely going to be power troweled. And I know this is a touchy subject. We're going to touch on it in a second with FFFL values. The concrete subcontractor has that FFFL value. The way they achieve that is not just doing a laser screed and striking off, is by troweling. And ACI defines the purpose of troweling to provide a smooth, dense, hard surface. So please, everybody on this call, you should assume before you test, as you're bidding the project, you should assume that concrete substrate surface will be non-porous and not the other way around.
Because nobody quantifies smooth.
Correct.
Now smooth can be like super tight glass, or it could be rough, but still smooth in someone's mind.
Correct.
I remember taking that photograph of one of the 3 dime-sized droplets there, and it did take those droplets were still there 7 minutes later. This was a 5,000 square foot space, and 50 feet over, the droplets that I placed there disappeared within 30 seconds.
Oh, I'm glad you said that, because just 2 weeks ago we were called the variable porosity, and this was an installer that had used our installed concrete flooring on a concrete with our product. They'd done a lot of projects with the same CM, construction manager, the same ready mix producer. I mean, everything was the same. And what he wrote me was, and this is a great adhesive, a Tarkett 965, no issue whatsoever, good for porous, non-porous, shout out, and what he's saying is that exactly what you just mentioned, that they were having difficulty in installing because not so much the water drop, but it's a manifestation of what you're saying. Using the same trowel size in one area, the adhesive was acting correctly. Um, the set time, the open time made sense, but 12 inches over, he said it was flash setting. And I'm like, that's variable porosity. So my guess is he was using the non-porous trowel size. This side over here was fine. He went over here. They were coming back later trying to do their drop. This side was good. This side had already tacked off. And he was like, we're wrestling trying to install.
And if it's an existing slab, who knows what's on the surface? You could have one product over on the left side and a completely different set of products on the right side, and take nothing for granted. Everything can vary.
The beauty of this, again, not because I drove. This is one of the ones I authored, but once you understand exactly how these water-based glues work, I would offer that at your point of installation, there's few tests more important than this one. The beauty of it is it's really cheap and really fast. So don't hesitate to do it often. The standard says 3 for the first 1,000 square feet, which is just ridiculous. But it's a consensus to get it through, to get it established. It's cheap, it's easy, it's quick. I mean, you can go through and drop 100 in a 10,000 square foot area really quick and get a sense. Holy heck, they must have tried a little harder over here because this half is all non-porous, whereas it's soaking right up here. You got to find that dividing line and
another good comment came in. This is which is very true. This is one of the reasons that installers love to skim coat the whole surface. It makes it consistent.
Correct. It'll give you that uniform surface, but I would just offer then, don't assume that it'll be porous, because actually it's not just, even though the standard says all concrete substrate surfaces shall be evaluated, it really needs to be after you skim coat, then test that as well. Because I had one project where the installer, great practice, they skim coated, and to even make it more smooth, they lightly sanded it. So this was a skim coat, they'd been lightly sanded, and when we did the water drop test, it looked just like the water drop that you did down there lower left there. It looked exactly the same on top of the skim coat. The prep was great, but the surface was still not porous. And had they followed, assuming it was going to be porous, then they would have been installing incorrectly. So again, all substrate surfaces, not just concrete. So please remember, skim coating to get you the same, to remove the variability and consistency of the surface is great, but then again, test for porosity.
Jason Ramsey makes a great point. Grind or sand first, so that you get rid of any contaminants. Don't assume that it's going to be contaminant free.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm seeing in your lower left picture here, because I could see the marks there, and I think it looks like a really, really good prep. And most likely that would have, because I could see ridges, or very small ones or whatever. And obviously, especially with drywall mud is the bane of every, I think, installer's existence, because I don't know what they do in there. It's like they're just Jackson Pollock paintings on the floor. Sometimes I've seen so much mud, it's kind of hard to get that off without grinding it off.
So like electricians' clippings.
There you go. So remember, skim, it's great prep, it's a great process, but then again, please remember to still do absorption on top. And like I mentioned before, I gave you that one example of the trowel size. If you look, again, a lot of pressure adhesives, it's the same trowel, whatever, but a lot of the water-based resilient adhesives, especially the wet set, they're going to have up to double the volume on a porous substrate as opposed to a non-porous. So not only is it the open time, it's also the volume of the adhesive is going to be applied. So you really, really know. And some are only 4 porous. So don't assume. And be prepared. I was involved with a 200,000 square foot project where the project specs had selected adhesive as recommended by the manufacturer. I was the only one to go to that manufacturer's literature, and the only 2 adhesives they recommended were only 4 porous substrates. So I alerted the project and saying, you might be looking at a $700,000 change order, because it says if non-porous, bead blast self level, just to change the glues. That's assuming the underlayment will be porous, which is a flawed assumption. So you could have gone through bead blasting and self-leveling just to get back to another non-porous surface. So instead, they just pick a different glue. So just be sure you understand that this substrate porosity thing is basically entered into almost every single product you install. Primers, sometimes your cementitious underlayments, for sure. Maybe not your skin materials unless you're going to a certain thickness. It's not just for adhesives. It's entering in almost every product you touch. So please be aware on this particular topic right here. pH, you mentioned pH before, Chris. pH was required since 1998. It got removed in 2021. F710 now no longer requires pH. It's left to the manufacturer of the product you're installing.
Is that not going to be changed and added back in, do you think?
Nope.
Hmm.
Nope. The discussion of what alkalinity is has been moved. It's all in an appendix, but the appendix to an ASTM is non-mandatory language. It's like a FYI. So for pH, it has been removed as a requirement of F710. That does not mean it has been removed as a requirement from some of the products you install. Some products have dropped it. Some adhesive manufacturers have dropped it.
Considering the way concrete's going these days, just getting more and more alkaline in nature.
So that's a
just
good
seems
point.
like,
That's a good point because, with the 1L cement and, with the increased amount of limestone and, a calcium carbonate, if it goes into solution, it will be a higher pH. It's good for concrete, by the way. It's good because alkalinity helps protect embedded steel and rebar and structural steel and things like that. But that is curious if it will swing back the other way. I think that the whole mechanics of pH, what they're getting at is if your moisture, this goes back to your moisture testing. If the moisture content of your concrete is low enough and the adhesive is being applied correctly, then there should be no condition where pH issue manifests. And like I said, there is literature that shows that there's enough water in some of these water-based adhesives that it itself can induce the alkali hydrolysis if it's not allowed to enough open time and it's non-porous. You put it down and you close it up too quick with your resilient flooring. So it's been removed from F710. There is a separate standard, but it's been pushed down to the manufacturers, whether they require it or not. So that's where that stands right now.
Yikes, because a lot of those installation guidelines coming from manufacturers from wherever in the world aren't necessarily going to, cover these.
Yeah, a little piece of paper inside the box that's this big. That's those instructions. Yeah, right.
Handwritten on the side of the carton.
Well, I'm just letting you know, pH. Your biggest defense for this right here is your adhesive. Most all your adhesive manufacturers will be very clear up front with the pH range. And if it's good to pH 14, then you're good. So just keep that in mind. It's been removed.
Here's an obvious question for you. Just go back to the title of F710. That it's exclusively about resilient flooring.
Right.
And yet I've heard from a couple of our people behind the scenes, they say, no, it's for all floor covering types. When you
well, that's actually what I started off with. I said, don't let the title fool you. And I can tell you why.
Yeah, why not put all flooring?
Well, because good point. And maybe we need it as a macro level, because the committee that oversees, so all of y'all want to join and come and participate, is called the F6 Committee on Resilient Flooring. So, and by the way, basically every big flooring manufacturer and adhesive manufacturer and underlayment manufacturer you can think of, they're on this committee. So, Shaw, Shaw is on that committee. So it's not like the carpet world is not being represented, and not just, and I know there's other carpets out there, Sativa, Tandis, underneath, I think the Tarkett brand, they're on there. So don't think it's not being represented. The titles, though, flow from, well, we're a committee that has purview specifically over resilient flooring, so we can't necessarily say this is for all flooring. However, in the scope of work, in the document title, it does say, though intended for resilient flooring, basically it doesn't mean it can't be used for other documents or other products. And I guess what I was getting at is a lot of these other flooring types still pull from the information in F710 to populate their installation instructions. So yeah, it does reflect, it seems kind of Mickey Mouse that we say, for the, preparation concrete slab for the installation of resilient flooring, that really just goes back to the title of the overall committee. That's why.
Okay.
So, as a matter of fact, all the standards say the same thing. And like you mentioned, there is a new ASTM. I will tell you, there's one major change. And it means nothing if a manufacturer doesn't adopt it. The major change is that the water's tested first. Always before, the drop of water was just willy-nilly put on the concrete, let 60 seconds, and then you test the water. Well, there's this big assumption in that. The assumption is that the water's pH is 7.0. Well, there's plenty of literature out there that shows that water exposed to the ambient environment will absorb carbon dioxide and become more and more acidic over time. So it's quite possible that your water actually has a pH of 6, not 7. And remember, pH is logarithmic. So instead of testing at 7 and going up to 10, a factor of a 1,000 increase, your water was at 6, that's a 10,000 increase. So the new standard is basically test your water first in a clean dish, record that pH, then to put the water on the concrete, wait 60 seconds, and then test, record that pH, and look at the delta, showing the change of pH from your test sample, as opposed to just assuming it's a pH of 7. Other than that, it's the same process.
Do that for every new layer of the sandwich.
Because it's whatever you're installing is going to be affected. And remember, everything you're installing now is water-based, and water causes residual alkalis to go in solution, because without water, or without a solution, you don't have pH. Bone dry concrete is very alkaline, but it doesn't burn you. Bone dry cement, it doesn't burn you. Or bone dry underlayment doesn't burn you. You get it wet, it'll burn you, because now those alkalis have gone into solutions.
I was taking what you were saying just to the next stage, which would be test the porosity of every new product you put down. So if you've got base concrete,
correct,
and you pour leveler everywhere, now you're going to have to
test
porosity test that leveler. Don't assume that it's going to come and give you that level of porosity you need.
100%. And matter of fact, I'm glad you mentioned that. Peter Craig called me Monday and asked me what I thought about tightening up 3191 to draw out and really hit that. Because I told you the example I had down in Lakeland about 6 months ago. And he started talking about it. I said, no, I get 100% support. And I told him my example. And he told me it just happened to him. And I think it was an underlayment where they tested, they applied, the underlayment went down, they started installing. The adhesive was not acting correct. They did substrate surface porosity on the underlayment. It was non-porous, and they were using the wrong trowel. They were using too much glue. But before, it wasn't required. So that is going to be changed. But you're correct. Every layer of the system, go back and substrate porosity again. Go back and test again, because it will affect what you're installing.
Okay, a quick question here from Nikki. She says, could you please clarify if the measurement tools / equipment used for pH, humidity, temperature measurements should be calibrated and certified so, or would any available measurement tools from a hardware store suffice? I think what we'd say is buy the best equipment you can, so that you know you're getting accurate results, because there's lots of dollars at stake here.
I can totally concur. With the pH, that's another thing with pH. It's a great question, Nikki. For the easier answer first, for ambient temp, ambient humidity, and substrate surface temp, there is no requirement yet in the standard to make those calibrated first. But I would agree with Chris, make sure you have the best tools you have and that they're accurate or pretty darn close, given the dollars at stake. However, for the new pH standard and for all your moisture testing, not calcium chloride because it's just salt, but the scale is supposed to be calibrated. And obviously your RH probes are supposed to be calibrated. But for the new pH standard, the emphasis on is using the electric probe because that can be calibrated. And the recommendation is that it be calibrated before use. And it's pretty easy to calibrate, kind of like you can calibrate it in different solutions. You can calibrate it, whereas the pH paper, you cannot. And there is history that, pH paper left in your truck gets hot over time. It will degrade and not work correctly. So that's why the emphasis is with pH testing is to use the electric meter, and that can be calibrated, just like moisture testing. If you're going to moisture test, all your tools should be calibrated. pH should be calibrated. pH meter is calibrated. Ambient temp, ambient humidity, dew point, or substrate surface temperature, those devices are not required. But like say, again, shout out to Tramex. Let's say you're using Tramex, you're slapping out a Tramex meter to do your dew point evaluation, then heck yeah, make sure that's calibrated. You push a button, boom, it's going to tell you if you're a dew point or not. So depends on what the
You
tool
can
you're
get devices
using.
that are like 3-in-1.
Right, the 3-in-1 it'll give you ambient, it'll give you ambient temp, ambient humidity, and surface, boom, it'll calculate it for you too. Those follow through the whole calibration protocol as well.
Every flooring store should have one of those. Oh my God.
Yeah, well, here's dew point evaluation. And we were talking yesterday. I was actually on a job site July in Central Florida, and the GC was losing their mind because the flooring wouldn't stick. I'm like, well, I'm in town, I'll drive by and go see. And if you've ever been in July in Central Florida, it's hot would be an understatement. And you need a scuba mask outside to breathe because there's so much fluid in the air. We go up to the third deck and I'm already drenched, and no lie, the inside window of the project looked like this window. And I'm like, sauna is exactly what it was. He goes to the floor. I'm like, I thought it was a joke. I said, are you kidding me? I go, it's too hot and humid in here. And he goes, well, you're just saying that the GC being the GC was, got their body part on their shoulder was going to get all frustrated. So you're just saying that. I'm like, there's the bucket. Let's pick it up. Turn it around, and had that box, 65, 85. I go, it's too hot and humid in here. I go, that's a water-based adhesive. You got water running down the inside of your window. I go, that adhesive is doing nothing. And he finally backed off. And I get a little agitated. I said, the only reason this was installed is either ignorance or malice, because it should never been installed. And he backed off. He said, what do I do? I said, take a bathroom, put an AC in there, get a dehumidifier. You got to get it somewhat controlled in this box or it's not going to work. They did it. We never heard from him again. So this is a big deal with the dew point. And I think, Jason, good point. It is the warm air coming into a cooler surface. And I think what Chris told me is that they had an ice rink underneath and they're going to play basketball. Well, that surface of the concrete is the surface of that wood is too cold. And now they got literally, liquid from the atmosphere pooling on the surface. But it wasn't until 2022 that dew point became a requirement for the installation of resilient flooring. Even though if you look at Carpenter Rug Institute, both CRI 104 and 105, they adopted it back in 2015. The glues changed in 1992. 30 years later, became the first requirement to measure the surface temperature of the concrete as a condition and as a correlation with the ambient temp and humidity. And I would offer at point of installation, beyond your normal clean and prep, dew point, substrate porosity, appropriate climate. Those three things are going to be probably your biggest drivers of point of install success.
This is why the whole dew point thing and condensation forming on concrete, which instantly absorbs that moisture, whereas the window doesn't. So you get to see the beads of water. This is why it's so important to do that electronic impedance test just before you trowel out the adhesive. Just put that test down, and it'll tell you whether you've just had a dew point event overnight, or if you've got conditions that you should be concerned about.
Or like Jason mentioned, say your slab is a little cooler. Say your slab is at 65. And by the way, you can look at the dew point chart, that 65 to 85 box for temperature and that 35 to 55% RH. There are points on that you hit dew point. So you could be at 55 RH and like 67 degrees, and you could be at dew point. You're in the box, but you're still at dew point. And think how insidious this could be. You could be at dew point spreading a water-based adhesive on top of a thin layer of moisture that you can't even see. That ain't going to work.
That's right. And you know what? We're finding out that this is more important than almost the moisture content and the substrate, the dew point issues, if you talk to the Peter Craigs and the Bob Higgins of the world.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, sir,
Exactly
Jason.
right.
I'm glad you said that. And I know Peter and Bob, and I know Bob has been recently really talking to dew point.
Yeah.
And let's go back to comparing this to moisture testing, and we can knock that later. But calcium chloride is a 72 4-day. Well, if you go to the first day to prep it and then leave it down, that's a 4-day event. That ain't quick.
Yeah, I got one set up right now, and it's just for quantitative numbers for their their warranty. But
Right, but I mean, it's not something you can it's not something you can do while you're installing and get a result.
no, you'd have to time it perfectly, right, to where you get
Right.
the
Yeah.
result.
I know I'm going to be there. I know I'm going to be there in 3 days. So, and I'm going to put another one, or the RH probe, even though it's rapid RH, when you're spreading glue and putting in your flooring, but the water drop and slapping the tray max and pushing a button, you can do that all day long.
If
Yeah, that
everybody
the
did-
Tramex quick check, that's what it's all about, in my opinion, with the gravimetrics.
Yes, sir.
100% agree, Jason. If everybody in the industry did that simple electronic impedance test, it's non-destructive, fast to do. Anyone can do it, and it delivers very effective results. We would see claims related to a moisture drop by what,
And the
50%?
water drop, because remember, if it's
Yeah.
porous, if it's non-porous, and you're using the big trowel, and you lay it in the surface no transfer, but you still got a lot of glue there with moisture, and let's say you're doing your bond test. If you use the big notch trowel, high volume on a non-porous substrate surface, and you got no transfer or just slight transfer, and you put in your sample, 3 days later, you're going to pull it back and it's going to be wet. And what does everybody say? Oh, that's moisture. If I'm standing there watching, I'm going to say 100% agree. It came from the adhesive. Whereas the whole industry's been taught, oh, that must be the concrete. But you do the water drop, oh, non-porous, Tramex, okay, I'm not at dew point, let me use the small trowel, boom. 10 feet later, do it again. Or have somebody just working ahead of your crew, boom, 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 boom. Again, anybody can do it, requires no training. Just put the water drop right next to it, hit your button for the impedance, get your dew point, keep moving forward. Keep moving forward.
Anybody on the call who wants to better understand dew point and they just want to play around with it, go to Google and just Google dew point calculator, and they pop up for free, and you can just put in temperatures, Fahrenheit, Celsius, whatever, and you'll figure out how this dew point is reached.
And guys
Guys
need to have their infrared thermometer so they can be that 5 degrees Celsius or 10 degrees Fahrenheit above that dew point with their hygrometer.
Correct. That's what Jason just said is very important. And I think we're changing it to 9 degrees because the way the Celsius conversion, whatever. But yeah, 10 degrees. The 5 degrees Celsius is that, and you want the temperature rising. Because if it's dropping and you got cold air coming in, or the temperature of the concrete is getting colder, it's not going to be able to, it's going to have a condensation. Think about a shower condensing on your cold mirror. So if your temperature of concrete is for some reason cooling, your chances of dew point occurring, and again, the reason why it's so important is conditions can change. Somebody can open a door. Like where I live in Central Florida in August, the space can be acclimatized, the concrete can be cool, somebody opens the door, and next thing you know, the whole corridor just got a nice warm blast of all this moist, humid air, and now you've got this friggin' wet slick that people aren't thinking about, and they're still trying to install flooring. It's easy enough to check if you got the right tool. Just just check, just keep checking. These are
Okay.
quick and easy and affect your installation. But these are now both in F710 as well. And again, there you go. Conditions can change throughout the day. It's not a fire and forget. It's not, I don't care what the standard says, 3 for the, 1 for the first 1,000 square feet or whatever. This you can do every freaking 10 feet. Just have somebody running through and doing it in front of you, do it throughout the day. The conditions can change, and you'll be good. Lastly, this is not yet an F710. Things we want to address. Chris talked to me about great pictures here. Level, even though it's a sine wave, it's still level, but then you're going to have flat, but not level. And one of the issues is really this document. This is the current wording from F710. And I know FCA Canada has a big issue with E1155. I get it. I understand it now. A lot of problems with that, but that's the current literature. That's what it says. So part of the problem is embedded in here, and this is good for concrete industry, but it's not good for the flooring industry. It's not good for the flooring industry. And so again, I think the standard, like the concrete industry has to meet this by day 3 after concrete placement. Day 3. Y'all aren't going to be there on a big project for another 18 months. The concrete's going to go.
They have to be able to show that they've met spec. And so that's what this does. It allows them to essentially say, yeah, we've done our job. Thank you very much. And invoice and go.
Pay us and go
Yeah.
at day 3 after placement.
Right.
But would it, anybody wants this slide deck, I'll be glad to have, but some of the things I want to point out to, if you get to another project we're involved with, if concrete's placed in cold weather, a lot of times the concrete subcontractor doesn't cure, they don't protect it. You can still have massive evaporation in cold weather because the concrete could be warm. It could be concrete mix could be 80 degrees, go down, heat of hydration. The ambient temperature could be 30, which is not really that cold. And it's going to evaporate very, very quickly. So if they're not curing, so if you had rapid evaporation, it could cause curling and also a temperature change. So some of the things that you may be facing, especially at your saw cuts, is something like the top right picture. And so in your area, if they're placing concrete in the winter and they're not protecting that surface to concrete to kind of keep it close to being warm, that cold air hits it and you can have your saw cuts be way out of whack. Project we're on right now, it's a full inch of the saw cut elevation. They passed their FFL in December, and now the saw cuts are all raised up, and everybody's floundering. Oh, I don't understand why, because the concrete wasn't protected after placement. This is basic mechanics of thermal contraction and expansion of concrete, also the evaporation rate. So if you come across something like the top right, and it's at a saw cut, that FFL value that they did at day 3 after placement does you no good. And plus, the peak will be at a cut, and I think you said 1155 does not go across the saw cut.
Yeah, it stops 2 feet from the saw cut.
Right where you're going to have the most
saw cut from the
right, which we're going to have the most level upwards lifting. So if you see
cut, but the moving joint.
It could be a cold joint or whatever, or obviously right here, this is trenching. That's not going to do any favors. FFFL, they've obviously come in and did a pipe repair there. You could have a dip, some deflections right there, especially for elevated slab. If you have deflection, that's going to cause you problems. They may have met it, but then again, something happened over time. But elevated deck, port and pan is deflected. Not you guys' issue. Obviously a long-term, you got this hump going on. Again, the concrete is going to move. Time of placement, first 32 hours, it has hardened, but it is still got a lot of expansion and contraction. And the amount of movement could be as much as almost an inch per 100 feet. And it doesn't matter how big the building is. It doesn't matter how big the concrete mass is. It will still follow the thermal contraction properties it can move through. So one of the things that we went through with Chris is we're going to try to change it. And it hasn't been voted on. It hasn't been put out to vote yet. So it's still open, Clayton. We haven't changed the wording. Well, it hasn't gone to ballot. I have proposed it, but it hasn't been balloted. So I can still change this. We are trying to tighten it up so it better protects the installer. So when you guys come in, you can say, well, that's a concrete thing.
Yeah,
We're
you're
installers.
not going to have the constructor telling you, it met standards months ago, get on with it, floor guy.
Correct. So we're trying to tighten it up. So everybody out there that's dealt with this, Chris Maskell, you may have heard of him, NFCA Canada brought it to my attention. And I am going to take the charge and bringing it up to the committee and try to get this included in F710. So that actually closes it out. Covered a lot of information. So Chris, back to you. Any other questions?
Well, I got a question. Someone asked me this morning, actually Taylor Adhesives asked me, gypsum question. F710 and gypsum, how does it apply?
Does not. It does not, because it's for concrete surface. The title of the preparation of concrete slabs, receivers, and flooring. Gypsum wants to say they're concrete, and they can say they're cementitious, but they can't say they're concrete. And the difference is that it's concrete, so it does not apply to gypsum. And by the same token, it doesn't apply to any underlayment at all.
Is that because of the calcium anhydride?
I think it's more than that. I think it's just because, you know, the structural, it's meant for structural concrete. So you got large aggregate, small aggregate. It was just evolved. I mean, I wasn't there when they originally wrote it in 98. But I do know it's only for concrete. But these other things we've talked about, dew point, porosity, would apply to anything you're putting it down. And also too, the preparation methods, you know, when you have, let's say, drywall mud, and you go in there with certain ways to remove it, you're grinding, you know, gypsum does not have the same surface abrasion resistance hardness that concrete does. You do some of the things to gypsum that you do to concrete, and I think you're going to start tearing up gypsum a lot faster than you would with concrete. So there's a lot more in F710 than just, you know, ambient conditions and now dew point, porosity, moisture, moisture testing. It says all concrete slabs shall be tested for moisture. Doesn't apply to gypsum. In fact, I think
now 710 applies to wood subfloor, right?
Nope.
Or, no. Okay.
Nope. And you know,
we still need our products. Our products still need to be 3/16 and 10 on these surfaces, though.
That's a good point. But see, again, F710 is narrow. You know, you make a good point. Because
F710 has its limitations. You just defer to the manufacturer's instructions, and industry standards will say 3/16. So
they'll put you into a loop, because then those manufacturer's instructions will refer you back to 710 or the FF. We just go in this cycle.
Well, we're going to try to good point, Jason. We're going to try to fix the FFFL, but you make a good point, because a lot of the you know, apartment buildings and new hotels, they're stick lumber, and a lot of times the underlayment, you know, across a wood substructures will be a gypsum base, and then they're installing whatever kind of flooring on top of that, right? That's like the Wild West, because there is no moisture testing requirement for gypsum, though. I guess you can actually, I think you can use plastic sheet and
the tray mix has a setting, and I have actually found that some of these gypsum substrates have more moisture, believe it or not, than you know, concrete substrate.
Yeah,
right. So
our standards say to electrical impedance test with gypsum.
Right. I'm just saying that, but it's a whole different standard, and I think there actually is a gypsum standard. I'd have to dig it up for you.
Yeah.
I think they still accept the plastic sheet test, which the resilient flooring side does not. T4263 plastic sheet test, and you know, water drops. So gypsum really needs its own standard. So read this, and let's call it 810 for preparing a gypsum substrate surface to receive. That's what's needed, because that does not exist. But I would offer porosity, dew point, ambient conditions. Doesn't matter. Well, not wood for porosity, but different kind of moisture. Well, if you're doing the underlayment, but ambient conditions, absolutely. You know, you can still measure the surface temperature of the wood. You know, whatever you're installing against, understand that your glue or whatever you're installing, that surface temperature is going to immediately impact it, once you spread it. So yeah, it's important to have it acclimatized. Well, we've acclimatized our buckets of glue. It's been there for 3 weeks. Yeah. On a pallet, acclimatize the ambient. The concrete is 20 degrees colder. And as soon as it goes from that bucket and you spread it, paper thin, it's going to cool down rapidly. So it's going to completely change it. So just think about all the things your industry has dealt with over the past 30 years. It wasn't just the glues changed. Look at what did not change with them. Moisture testing wasn't added until 6 years later. The requirement to condition the space wasn't added until 9 years later. The requirement to evaluate the substrate porosity wasn't added until 20 or 30 years later. I mean, this is, or 20 years later. These statistics are kind of ridiculous.
Dean, got a question. How would gypsum absorbency be tested to be considered non-porous?
Again, it would be a whole different ballgame. Because I'm thinking
You're not going to
it
apply
would
the
be
60-second rule.
no, I'm thinking it would absorb a lot quicker.
Yeah, gone in a flash.
Right.
It doesn't.
So gypsum might be one of those underlayments that it should be going in assume that the surface is porous, as opposed with concrete, you should go in assuming it's non-porous. Well, again, that's a good point. And I'm not going to be the volunteer. I'm not the one who's going to volunteer. But there should be a standard practice for preparing gypsum substrate surface to receive resilient flooring.
ASTM F710A.
But it's a great point. It's an excellent point. Remember porosity, remember dew point, remember ambient conditions, and it pretty much applies to almost, you can be doing resilient flooring on steel. Everything I just said still applies.
Another question.
Sure.
Question from Dave Hamilton of Ozen. Is there a maximum fly ash / slag content in concrete that ASTM recognizes for flooring?
ASTM F710 is silent on that. You would have to go to ACI, and I know there's been 50% slag replacement, so 50% cement, 50% slag. They also have ternary blends where you'll have say 50% Portland cement, 25% ash, 25% slag, but they don't have ASTM on the flooring side they're silent on that discussion. They would say make it aware. You bring up a good point, specifically with ash. And ash has been blamed for a lot of things about, like, quote unquote, nothing sticks. If you look at the chemical makeup of fly ash, it has a very similar chemical makeup to cement in the concentration of silicon dioxide. In ash is going to react inside the concrete. It's non-pozzolanic, it's non-hydraulic. It's not going to, you could take ash and water, mix it together, and you're going to have muddy ash. Slag is a little different. If you take really, really fine blast furnace slag, it is slightly pozzolanic, and you mix it, it will set up on its own and eventually get hard. The issue with ash is it's usually a finer powder. And so when you do your mix design and it goes into the concrete truck and you dump it and you spread it out like, the peanut butter, that large aggregate is going to start to settle, displacement, and then water is going to start coming up, your bleed water. Well, your ash particles are a little bit more fine. So there's a good chance you're going to have a higher concentration of those ash particles near the surface. So when they do go off and get hard, you're more likely to get even a more hard, dense surface. People say, well, that holds the moisture in or whatever. Well, the moisture content beside that, remember, porosity just became a requirement in 2021, 30 years after the glues changed. So I'm not sure that a lot of things that the ash mixes got blamed for were because of the ash, because we've never had an issue bonding to ash, or is because ambient conditions, dew point, and porosity weren't being evaluated, and the surface of the concrete was just that much more dense. But
I think
no,
if you're prepped to do a good quality porosity test, you're probably going to protect yourself from a batch or a mix design that contains a lot of fly ash. I think it's a density issue.
It's good. Their
such a
surface,
tight
yeah, your
surface.
surface is going to be much more dense. Your surface is going to be dense because the way the way it's going to settle up and hard. But I've done projects with 20, 30% ash. I've done projects with 40% slag. And as long as the ambient conditions, substrate surface temperature, dew point, porosity were kept in the box, think about it. You can install resilient flooring to steel, as steel is pretty non-porous.
Make sure you got the right adhesive and you use it in the right way.
Yeah, interesting. I had a conversation with Peter Craig, and thank you, by the way, gents, on this issue. I was chatting with Peter Craig last week because I'm involved in something where the design professionals want to reduce the carbon footprint. And Peter's suggestion was anything to a maximum of 10%. Anything beyond that becomes very dangerous. And he said there's a big failure that's going on in San Francisco that's pretty significant, that brings everybody onto the table, from the flooring people right through to the end users. And, you know, like going back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we were reading technical bulletins coming out of the US suggesting 15 or 20% should be fine. You know, fortunately in my career, I haven't had a failure. I had an aquatic center where we had some pretty high fly ash content, and we had to do some sandblasting of the walls before the tile installation. But, you know, when you start hearing these things, and when you talk to a guy like Peter Craig, who's so darn knowledgeable, and he says, well, it should be a maximum 10%. And it's like, holy cow, like maybe there's things that we haven't experienced yet. But you just think about shutting down a big facility, a government facility, to have a problem like that. I mean, it can put a lot of people out of business really quick, but the liability is so huge. So that's why I asked, just because I'm
Let's,
No, it's a good
let's-
question. ASTM on the flooring side is silent. Now, I know Peter's involved with, they just published the new version of, it's called ACI 302.2, Design of Concrete Slabs to Receive Moisture Sensitive Flooring. The first publication of that was 2006, and took them 17 years, but they got the new one out. It just came out. I don't know if that's been revamped to address the recommendation for SCM, supplementary cementitious material replacement. I don't know if that's been addressed.
Dean,
But it's
let's,
nothing in F710 though.
let's just bring in Keith Robinson. You got a good comment here. You put your hand up. Are you still there, Keith?
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, the questions about fly ash in particular and other supplementary cementing materials. I'm gonna say I'm the concrete nerd in the room. I love talking about concrete. Don't get me started. But in this case, yeah, a lot of the concerns about fly ash have built up over generations. I mean, we used to try to throw and cram as much fly ash into stuff as possible because of all the greeny weeny stuff that we have to do as architects and engineers. We learned very quickly that, you know, fly ash content greater than 10% on anything which required finishing was a non-starter, because you couldn't finish the floor properly. The concrete, you know, would gel up. So when you're troweling, you're pulling off pieces of the surface. It was hard to work. It delayed the concrete set, and when it did set, it turned almost
Definitely,
instantaneously.
you know, but with the delayed set, and so the surface being gelatinous, because fly ash is not pozzolanic, not hydraulic, basically inside the concrete mix, you would have to wait for the cement to hydrate, give off calcium hydroxide. So then the fly ash could start.
That's what I was gonna say, yes. We've learned over time, engineers, not to do that kind of stuff. Like we'll still put like 40% fly ash into like foundation elements because who cares? You know, it'll set up and we'll have superior concrete that nobody sees or touches for the life.
As long as you expect, you know, don't expect the 28 break.
Exactly.
You may have to go to, that's a good point though. Yeah, for mass concrete or things like that. Ash is a natural retarder. So if you have let's say you have hot water in the mix, but you have cold temperature is a retarder. Now you have a double whammy where you're the greater portion matrix of your concrete is hydrating on schedule, the surface is gelatinous because it's cold, and you got a high degree of ash, it can cause a lot of problems.
And that's an emerging problem as we get into more and more sustainability, low carbon concrete. I do a lot of work with inland cement people and Lafarge. They have all sorts of sustainable mixes. They all require special curing conditions where we're not looking at 28-day tests, we're looking at 56-day tests, 72-day tests. Everything that requires sustainability requires more patience. It is better concrete than the initial green mixes that we had, but of course you've also got to bust like 10,000 cylinders to make sure that your concrete is behaving the way it's supposed to. The big thing about ultra high alkalinity in concrete these days is, yeah, it's had some effects over the last 20 years that we weren't expecting structurally, and we've got some premature failure of certain concrete mix designs because we didn't do enough testing. But yeah, I think to blame everything on fly ash, it's a non-starter. Typically, we're going to reduce fly ash for concrete slabs for workability to actually no more than 5 to 7%, just because. For vertical,
especially if you're going to try to get an FF value, you're going to try to put a finish on it. So it's going to be that's going to be self-regulating, and not to mention, I mean, at least in the U.S. and I'm sure where you guys are, the supply of fly ash is dropped off the cliff because
we used to have some of the best fly ash on the continent right here in Edmonton.
Oh, okay,
but you it all up there. Yeah, there's no good fly ash anymore. You know,
well, I mean, with a reduction with going to natural gas power plants, you know, not burning coal, because fly ash for civil construction, it's actually a great counterbalance to ASR, alkali silica reactivity. So as we get into, you know, worse and worse aggregate, it's a great counterbalance. It's a very cheap counterbalance. The problem is the supply of fly ash is getting non-existent. So that is probably going to solve itself.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings in the other problem with modern concrete. And that's, you know, well, again, it's not so modern, but, you know, more recent concrete. And that's from the concrete kilns themselves that we actually are recycling the dust that accumulates in the flues, you know, the chimneys, and putting that into the cement mix. Doesn't bother the cement mix, but it does change the way the concrete works. So
correct.
Yeah.
You know, if I may say something here, is as we go with more exotic supplementary cementitious material, the challenge for the concrete finishers is that the timing where they can go with their power trowel kind of wiggles, you know, between one type of filler to the next. And when they over trowel to meet those FF and FL numbers, that over troweling, like you said, brings all those special fines to the surface, and it can create a lot of bonding issues.
Yeah, that creates that dense surface that we're trying to get away from. You know, like, in fact, as a specifier myself, I'm trying to minimize the amount of floating, you know, the power troweling that's done, because the guys, you know, when they're out there, they want to crank up their trowels as steep as they can go, polish, burn the surface, you know, get a beautiful surface, you know, and
then have to shot blast and rework it.
Guys, yeah.
Keep your FL low and plan a topping.
Yeah. Plan a topping, or, you know, plan for other things like, you know, surface planing, you know, cut and fill, things like that. It's a much better, more productive use of people's time and the carbon budgets.
Yeah.
Sorry, I told you.
Also, I told you not with the low carbon cement is, you know, a lot of the finishing is they're trapping bleed water in underneath to start with and dealing with delaminations, you know, a month down the road or 3 months down the road, stuff like that. So
right, you'll either delame the surface, or you'll get a dusty surface.
Yeah, so it's all those different types of water that's becoming a problem, and yeah, we have to deal with it and find it and make sure that the floor coverings aren't affected by it. It's been a great thing. Like I said, you shouldn't have got me started talking on concrete, because that will just take this whole thing offline. So
well, we are here talking about 710, right? It's all about the concrete. So, you know, I think we're almost at an hour and a half. We've way gone over our time. How do you talk about and complete talking about a topic like 710 in 1 hour? You just can't. So, fortunately, we're recording this for all of those folks who had to jump off early because you're scheduled outside of this hour. Dean, I think we're going to let you off the hook. And
Well, for those who see it, if you feel free to, Chris, please pass off my email. So if anybody, if I reference this particular document or reference, and they want to know where they got this, or if they want the slide deck, you know, have them feel free to reach out to me. I don't mind at all.
This is what, part of what these sessions are all about, is making great connections. We are now talking to the experts, people who know their stuff at a deep level. You're going to get good feedback and support if you have a problem out there. So yeah, if you can't get hold of Dean, you can contact him through us and all the other presenters that we put on month to month. So yeah, Dean, thank you so much. When we
Oh,
get
absolutely.
we'll have a drink and